Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. I'm just going to give you guys a really quick preview of what I'm actually working on today. Today I'm actually working on a mummy design, but I didn't want to make it the typical mummy that you normally see in the movies or that you normally see as actual mummies from the pharaoh's time that were buried. Now, as you can see, I just roughed in the character using very basic shapes to get the overall pose and make sure that the motion that I wanted to have for this character read properly. So at this stage, I'm not concerned about details, I'm just concerned about the pose mainly. So that's the reason why I haven't added too much anatomy to it. It's very rough, loose. It's also very quick, because at this point I can make changes very quickly and easily without wasting too much time, and that's very important for me. I don't have very much time, so any moment I have spare time, I would ideally like to be playing some video games as well as drawing. So in order to get some of that spare time, I do have to work very quickly, and the quickest way for me to work is to initially figure out the rough pose of the character and make sure that that pose is perfect before I actually move on to any of the detail. So as you can see now, I'm actually starting to add some of the details. I haven't done too much reference. I did do a bit though. I did look at some actual mummies online. I also looked at other people's interpretation of mummies. So I did look at some screenshots of the actual trilogy of the Mummy, because it does make pretty good reference in certain areas. But once again, I wanted to keep this my own design, so I did avoid using too much of those specific references because they're already interpreted in a certain way. So I did try to stick to a little bit more realistic reference material when I was actually beginning this piece. Now, I also wanted to try out, when I was doing the referencing, I did notice that a lot of the mummies, the way they were preserved, the skin was actually really close to the body. So it didn't look as if it was all that much decomposed. It pretty much looked as if somebody had literally removed the moisture from the body of the mummy before it was actually placed in the tomb. So taking that into consideration, I did want to make sure that the bones and the shriveled up look did show through. Although most of this wouldn't be seen at the end result because it would be covered up by the bandages, I did want it to have it structurally there because I was also trying to figure out how to actually draw that, how to make it look as if the character is slightly shriveled up. Now, although I did want the character to look shriveled up, I did not want all the muscles to be gone. I did want certain muscles to still be there, just because it makes a more appealing drawing overall. I could have easily mummified the legs and arms a lot more. I didn't really add any shrinking of the muscles in those areas. I did keep those normal as I was actually drawing, but I just made sure to add more muscle tissue that was showing. So the way I actually approached that is actually very similar to the anatomy drawing I did last week, which is also part of the reason why I did that anatomy drawing. It helped me figure out how I was actually going to do an approach to drawing. So once I figured that out, as you see, I just worked in grayscale, trying to figure out the detail for this, how it would actually be structured. Because like I said, I hadn't drawn something that looked like this ever, so I needed to find out how I was actually going to approach this, just for future reference, so that if I do have to do this later on, for another drawing, I already have the knowledge base that I need to work a lot faster on that drawing afterwards. Because once you learn these techniques, generally you don't normally forget it all that easily. They do tend to stay with you, so as long as you do a correct study, any information you've gathered from that previous drawing you can cross-apply to many other drawings that you might work on in the future. Now, because of the complexity of just figuring out how I was actually going to render out the body in general, I did leave the hands and the feet last, as well as the head, just because figuring out the torso actually allows me to figure out how I'm actually going to render the rest of these details. it makes it a lot easier for my workflow to do these lasts. Now, if I was in a production light setting, I wouldn't be able to do that simply because I would have to do so many drawings a day, and I would need to be able to show a somewhat looking finished piece at any moment. So for this reason, if you're doing concept or you're planning to do actual concept, this workflow might not be ideal because you do have to fully render out and fully work on the entire character at all times in order to be able to show a finished drawing at any moment. Now, as you see, I'm just tightening up some of those lines because they're a little bit too foggy for what I'm trying to achieve. Now you see me actually working on the feet. Now, because most of these areas are actually in shadow and you won't actually see all the detail, I don't have to go fully detailed in certain areas. Now, this hand I had actually quite a bit of problems figuring out, because I did want to have that look of a very strained look on that hand. And I didn't quite achieve it with the finished drawing, but I did try a couple different ways of actually drawing out that hand before I came up with one that I was at least somewhat satisfied with. Like I've said before, hands, I do spend a little bit more time on them normally, but in this case, I was heavily restricted on time, so I didn't have as much time as I normally do for these pieces. This piece took I'd say about 5 hours to actually start to finish. So it wasn't too long of a piece at all. But like I said, because I do have a lot of time restrictions, I'm actually preparing for a show right now, convention at Comic-Con in Ottawa for May the 12th and 13th. So because I'm preparing for that, I don't have as much time to work on this. As you can see, I'm just adding the bandages in. Now, most of the detail, like I said, is actually being hidden by those bandages, but certain areas will show through, and because I figured it out fully, it does make the character read a lot better. Just adding some quick jewelry to make it look a little bit more realistic. Now, I did have to go back to my reference in order to figure out how to actually do the hat for him. I had done it previously, so I just referenced one of my previous drawings for this. Normally, I would actually reference proper reference for this on the how to actually make a hat like this. How-to videos on actually making certain costumes are actually really beneficial, because then you figure out how it's actually constructed, and once you understand that, it's a lot easier to draw because you already understand how it would have to be made. I actually have, as one of my references, it's a huge volume where it just covers fashion. Now, most of the fashion that's in that book is not normally stuff I would draw, but it is stuff that I can incorporate with my existing drawing style. So for this reason, I do have that reference. It is a very important reference to have. I have a couple of books like that. They're all life reference, so they're actually costume designs that were actually a professional photographer actually took photos of. And that's the type of reference you want to lean towards when it actually comes to doing pieces like this, because that reference does show you how to properly construct and how these clothing items would actually wrap around the character as well. As you can see, I'm just making sure that the shadows are correct on this character, making sure that there's shadows underneath the cloth, otherwise it doesn't look proper and it looks separate from the character. Now you'll notice too, as I actually worked on this piece, I didn't fully render out all the bandages. It's not necessary. In most cases, this type of material would actually be somewhat transparent because it would actually be made out of gauze. So because of this, you wouldn't actually see a whole lot of detail in the bandages themselves. And that's the reason why making sure to show the anatomy below that is important, because you would see through those bandages in certain areas especially. So that makes it look more realistic as well. Just working quickly on the background. I wanted to keep the background, once again, very simple. You've seen me use a couple times some textures. I just wanted to show you guys how I would actually render this out if I was not using a texture. As you saw, I figured out the perspective really quickly, and from there I used that as a guide to allow me to actually create the proper perspective in this drawing. Now I do have to constantly reference back to my character as well. It's important because the background does have to fit the character. I did start off with the character. The character is the focal point in this piece, not the background. So although the background isn't as important as the character, it does still have to be able to stand by itself as well. But it also can't take away from the character, because that's not the point of the background in this case. Now, because of the way I drew the light source on the character, I did have to pretty much explain where that light source was coming from, which is why I did add that opening above the character, so it does help explain that. Now to give the rocks a little bit more of a textured look, I added just a bit more highlights in uneven areas and made sure to add some cracks into there as well. That small amount of detail makes a huge difference in the overall piece, makes it look a lot more realistic, a lot more readable, and for that reason it's really important to add that at least afterwards. So what you just saw me do is I just added a basic color to start with. I knew I wanted to mainly use yellows in this piece, so for this reason I just added a color layer with just a simple yellow, and once again I'm just using the basic color palette with just a couple of extra colors that I've added. These are pretty much all your default colors that you start off with in Photoshop. Don't really need too much more than that. Now I'm just adding some red into this because I did want to show some of the tissue. Although realistically a mommy wouldn't have that showing, just because it does discolor, but not to that degree. It doesn't turn red. I believe it turns dark brown instead. But like I said, I wanted to give it my own twist, so for this reason I used red instead of browns. Also, the red will also show up a lot better than using the browns in this case, especially next to the yellow. So all I'm doing right now is I'm just making sure that those bandages read correctly, because they need to still be able to stand out. So I'm just highlighting some of that detail in there to make sure that it does read correctly. Just tweaking some of the shadows on the feet to make sure the character looks grounded. It's very important to make sure that your character is grounded in any drawing. One of my teachers, he used to describe people's drawings, especially when they were first starting out, as having a sloping floor grid, because the perspective was too steep for the character to actually be able to physically stand on. It's okay to use that, but you need to understand when to use it. So this is the finished piece. I hope you guys like it. It was actually really fun to do. I was experimenting a bit more with the anatomy, so that was kind of a nice change as well. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.